So it is a great honour to be here to launch this wonderful little book, and I have roughly three sorts of comments to make. The first comment has to do with the implied author of this little book. The second has to do with the history of traditions which are engaged in this book, and the third has to do with the Sitz im Leben of this work.
Oh.
So let's get started. The implied author. The implied author means, of course, the author as implied by the text and nothing but the text. So this is to be distinguished from the actual person that we know and love. At least I have known and loved him for a long time. And the actual person does other things like, coordinate the Earth Bible project and other things that are not directly mentioned in this book, so they are tangential. So you would need to do some historical, critical, archival work in order to discover the broader profile of the author, rather than the implied author of this book. But far better than that would be simply to listen to Norm preach.
Preach?
Yes. I'll come back to that word in due course. The scholarship and the preaching, that combination has been an extraordinary contribution in our country for a very long time. So the story actually doesn't begin with Norm in some individualist, even Lutheran sense, but it goes back to a larger Lutheran story, beginning with the great-grandfather who came to Australia as a refugee in the 1850s. And that's a nice touch, to embed a larger Lutheran story and a larger family story into the considerations, the larger framework for how to consider these particular reflections in this little book. So the implied author, some half a century ago, provided a little essay in the Concordia Theological Monthly on the Gospel of Abraham. And some 2 decades ago, facilitated as scribe the Rainbow Spirit Theology discussion, which is still being used, debated, and informing all sorts of Aboriginal conversations. Most recently, in our college in Melbourne, we had a number of Aboriginal people who are meeting right now in our college as a result of the collaboration with the NAICS network, the North American Indigenous Network. And they're still talking about Rainbow Spirit Theology. And then, of course, there was The Land is Mine, which I have taught in a class on land, 4 or 5 times, which was published by Fortress Press. Now, this is an interesting thing on the Sitz im Leben, which I will come to. That was published by Fortress Press, whereas the little book called Reconciliation was published by Mosaic, which, as we know I didn't know, but I've sorted out the genealogy here. Mosaic is in the genealogical succession, the earlier generation of Morning Star. And I'm told that Morning Star has been enfolded within the Bible Society, so there are generations of these local Australian publishers, but Morning Star's identity is being preserved in good, patrilineal manner. We'll come back to that. So, the history of traditions. Now we've gone to descent groups. There are, in terms of the main arguments in this book, clear distinctions between El, the creator spirit of the Canaanites, and Yahweh, the national deity of Israel. The relationship between El, the creator spirit of the Canaanites, and Yahweh, the promising God of Israel, is a rather complex one, which Norm very helpfully makes even more problematic for us. Wonderfully so, because if you went to seminary as I did in the 1980s, you would have been told, according to the textbooks, that there was this theory, J-E-P-D, right? And indeed in some, well, should be more specific, in some neo-documentary hideouts like Yale University, they are still taught J-E-D-P. But this is a not quite so simplistic account, but nevertheless a critical account of how that Yahwistic language, that very specific national naming of God, relates to El, the creator spirit of the Canaanites. So the very specific covenant versions that are discussed in Genesis 15 and Genesis 17 have their own chapter 5. And Genesis 15 is linked to that more specific Yahwist tradition, or Yahwistic tradition, that is the use of the divine name rather than the literary source J, which is what we used to be taught in seminary in the 80s and 90s and still in Yale. You like that, did you? I hope so. That's distinguished from the contribution in Genesis 17, which we were, for a long time taught was a priestly contribution. But what was that priestly contribution? That priestly contribution was included an insistence that the ancestors were not Yahweh's. Very specific in Exodus 6, 2 and 3. None of the ancestors were Yahweh's. So it doesn't matter whether you have some fancy theory, whether, documentary or fragmentary or redactional nuances as we have in more complex recent theories. There is a denomination which says none of the ancestors were Yahweh's, and another denomination that says yes, they were. And making that problematic point about the ancestors is key to this book. But it also raises a theological question in many respects for the hermeneutical move, the application move. How do we get to the analogies with Australian Aboriginal experience and our own settler experience if the Yahwistic form is linked to the settler colonial self-confidence of a promised land that we come to claim, as opposed to a respect for El, the creator spirit, which by analogy links to the creator spirit of Aboriginal people. So these are rather complex historical matters which are treated very lightly, gently in this book, because there is an intent that these difficult questions might be read and digested by a much wider audience than you might expect in a critical historical study of Genesis. Chapter 7 puts to one side, in some respects, the more militant version of Deuteronomy and the promises to Abraham, now taken to be the promises to the triad of ancestors, Abraham, Isaac and Jacob, who found only a national imagination. So in more recent critical discussion, that's all linked to, Pentateuch redaction theories, which are very newfangled. They're not taught at Yale. That's a more European discourse. And I love all that stuff. I love it. It's much more exciting than it was in the 80s when I went to seminary in America. But that's not why this book exists. This book exists to provoke questions about the naming of God and the significance of these names and what difference it makes for not just historical reconstructions of the history of Israelite religion, as it used to be taught, but rather how this kind of questioning engages our own political and theological imagination today in our own context in Australia. Perhaps more broadly in settler colonial context, but very particularly in Australia. This is a very Australian book, which is what I love about it. More land scholars will no doubt want to respond to chapter 8, the spiritual Abraham and St Paul's reinterpretation, where the spiritualising of Abraham starts to leave the ground. So that's an invitation to more conversation. Chapter 9 on the crucified land That's where perhaps the Earth Bible might be engaged in another conversation. Chapter 10 has a very brief and biting acknowledgement to Aboriginal spirituality and proposals for a treaty. And those formulations, densely poetic, liturgical formulations of acknowledgement, really belong to a much larger audience than Chapter 11. Chapter 11 is the challenge for the churches. And this is where getting a sense of our Sitz im Leben starts to come into play, I think. Because if you look at our stats, the Australian statistics for religious adherence, maybe 50% might have a broader spiritual understanding that's allied in some way with Christianity and might engage with Chapter 10, acknowledging Aboriginal spirituality and treaty making. But there's what's the word? It's tiny, let's confess. It might even be as small as 5% of us who go off to church regularly and who might get engaged in how the churches might be needing to make particular reparations and make particular movements towards treaty making. So Chapter 11, the challenge for the churches, is actually addressed by implication to a rather small percentage of the Australian population. Whereas Chapter 10, the acknowledgement of Aboriginal spirituality and the political implications that flow to that goes to a very large percentage of the Australian population. So this takes us to section 3 of this little talk, the Sitz im Leben of this book. It turns out that this book is not written for scholars. It turns out that this book is written at one level for the churches, beginning with the Lutheran churches. There's a lot of reference to South Australia and the Lutheran churches, and rightly so. Some wonderful historical details that are yet to be dealt with in the Australian kind of larger legal conversation. South Australia sticks out because we had this settlement requirement to do treaties which were never done. So Norm's highlighting that. But then, beyond the churches, there's this question of the caring agencies which the churches control at a governance level, but they don't really control in terms of policy and practice. So the Anglican or Anglicare and Uniting Care and Baptcare and so forth, these are agencies that deal in a very secular way with a much larger audience, and they should be reading this book, I think. Then there's the larger civil society, many of whom don't identify as religious, or at least if they do, they might identify with other religious traditions. And then there are governments. So if we're talking treaty, we're talking governments. And now we have a legal problem in Australia, because strictly speaking, only the highest federal government, Commonwealth government, should be making treaties. But we have states beginning to talk about treaties. So this book engages particularly a South Australian venture to make a state-based treaty. There's a lively debate going on in Victoria about a state-based treaty. Other states not so interested. So this is a political problem. How do we, within the churches, or the caring agencies associated with the churches, or the larger spiritual tradition that somehow identifies as Christian spirituality and wants to engage in a broader way with Aboriginal spirituality, how does all that goodwill that's articulated in this little book feed into the aspirations for treaty making? And it's complicated. It's complicated. And so I want to suggest that this be the provocation for another book. That the next book, it's all right, Norm, the next book doesn't need to be written by you particularly. You could have some role in provoking this book into existence, but the next book needs to engage political scientists, historians, legal minds, theological minds, people in caring agencies that deal with Aboriginal people, the whole range of multidisciplinary concerns that might feed towards the actual practice of treaty making. In some respects, this is a liturgical or homiletical argument. in that it goes from a reading of scripture to what you might do in church as you make confessions or provoke people to a spiritual self-examination or awakening. But we need to get beyond the homiletical model of hermeneutics to the more intellectually broader, interdisciplinary engagement with all the relevant disciplines: history, law, politics, and the broad range of social sciences that are going to need to be engaged in any treaty-making process. And of course, we need a treaty. That's what this little book is telling us, why we need it. And the steps towards it need more than this. So let's go. The next book, let's generate a larger conversation. But as Norm gets to his feet, I want to say, Norm,
Oh, yes.
as I've said, I've known you and loved you for a long time, and your provocations are the model of how biblical studies should be done in Australia, to my mind. So thank you once again.
Thank you very much, Mark. The whole process of moving from where I was to that, I deliberately decided that I would start where I knew, namely Abraham. And the Abraham precedent was a precedent for me to be able to trace the process. And the process of what's happened and what the missionaries did, etc., 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 that whole process of how we treated the Aboriginal people's land, how we treated their faith, and how we didn't consider them possible treaty partners at all. All of that's in the background. And just to illustrate this, what hurt me as much as anything, I think I can just get this one screen. I thought if you press back. Oh, I was pressing the wrong thing. Going back. That's it. You see that monument? That monument is in the middle of the Barossa Valley, where my ancestors first came in the 1850s, 1450s, 60s. They came there, and if you look at that monument, the ancestors had a promised land syndrome. They believed that they had a divine right to take this land. It was terra nullius, etc., etc. The monument on Mangler's Hill in the Barossa in 1992 celebrates 150 years in the promised land. The promised land for the Lutherans, for crying out loud, among others. Text: the Lord has given us this land. Joshua 2 verse 10. Anybody know what's wrong with that? It was spoken by Rahab the Canaanite, but they misquoted the text reference. But in fact, they mean it to be, the Lord has given us, the white settlers, this land. So the Aborigines are equivalent to the Canaanites who could be removed from the so-called promised land. That's a precedent in my history. And I think it's important to know that I, despite my age, I'm willing to stick my neck out and say it's time that the churches, which is the one group I know at this point, that the churches take a stand, receive a challenge, and acknowledge the land as being their land from the beginning. Their land, not just native title, which is strictly token. It is their land. Also to acknowledge their faith as not simply that's rubbish or pagan or whatever, but as a faith in the Creator Spirit in this land, like that of Abraham. To take a stand and say, look, we recognise treaty as being a valid way of proceeding and pushing the government, that's where the next book comes, pushing the government whatever way they can, through whatever agency they can, not to dismiss the Uluru document of the state, but to actually proceed with enabling a voice to be present in the Constitution. And so I began where I can, that is, with my theological and biblical heritage, to present the case. But I would agree, and I actually talked to a lawyer recently about the possibility of moving the confrontation in such a way, not that it's just a book, but the book gives the background for the basis of confronting the government with the fact that we have degraded, abused the Aboriginal heritage by what we've done, and to move beyond simply saying sorry, move to some sort of action, a treaty action, a treaty process. And I'd like to see that happen. So if anybody would like to have a look at, get a copy of the book, it's just $10 for the launch volume, and there's also a copy here of the challenge for the churches. And if you're interested, take a copy, take it to your church, take it to whatever political leader or whoever you've got that you might be able to use. I'll just read a couple of lines to show you just how painful, how powerful it could be if we dared to do this. For the acute consciousness of our settlement history, after following the trail of Abraham, we invite the churches, this is just for the churches at the moment, to take the lead and acknowledge, in relation to land, that we have often discounted the capacity of Aboriginal people to be true custodians, unlike Abraham, who recognised Canaan as the coast country and settled in Canaan as a worshipping community member. In relation to faith, that we have often dismissed Aboriginal beliefs in the Creator Spirit as paganism, unlike Abraham, who recognised Ale, the Creator Spirit of the people of Canaan. In relation to treaty, that we have often ignored the capacity of Aboriginal peoples to function as citizens of the host country and negotiate a treaty with them, unlike Abraham, who made a treaty with an Indigenous community in Canaan. And I would like to think that's just a beginning of the process of people like churches and other groups with conscience that actually recognise it's more than saying sorry for the top generation. It means acknowledgement of custodianship, acknowledgement of role, the whole process, acknowledgement of their faith, their belief as part of the rich part of the culture of Australia. I would like to see that happen, and I thank Matthew for promoting my book. Thank you very much.